ancient Romans loved the arena. And the stars of the arena were the gladiators.
And life was full of death.
But there's an untold story.
It was spectacular, it was dangerous, and it was exciting.
The Romans invented a new class of gladiator, and they fought animals.
We really don't know who is going to die.
For the animals, it was a no-win situation. They were forced to fight men, women, and each other.
There was something of a curiosity of the Romans as to who was top dog, if you like, in the animal world.
The Romans captured animals at the edge of the empire and transported them back to Rome across thousands of miles of land and sea.
Can you imagine what this would be like with a boat full of elephants?
Prepare to journey back to a time when animals lived in fear.
The Romans were downright unsympathetic to animals.
The Romans forced the animals to become the world's first four-legged executioners.
It was intended as a deterrent. I mean, these deaths were intentionally made as gruesome as possible.
What drove the emperors to be so cruel?
If you're going to dominate the world, you've got to dominate nature.
How many animals did the Romans kill?
It's possible that the number of slain animals may have extended into the millions.
And how do the Roman blood spectacles still live on today? Have we really learned our lesson?
We are much more destructive on the animal stocks than the Romans ever were.
This bear is about to die. For the past several months, ever since his capture in the land we now know as Scotland, he's been caged up in a space no bigger than a modern-day elevator. Next to him, a Barbary lion, caught in Morocco. His very existence as a species under direct challenge by the most powerful army in the world, the legions of Rome. Also under lock and key, a Bengal tiger, originally from India. These wild animals are spending their final hours in a basement. They are about to become unwitting stars in the biggest show in town, the opening of the Roman Colosseum.
The Colosseum was the Superdome of its day. It allowed the Romans to put on spectacles, the likes of which we haven't seen until perhaps the modern Olympic opening ceremonies or the Super Bowl halftime show. It made Rome both the entertainment and the political capital of the empire.
The year is AD 80. The opening ceremony is being presided over by the Roman Emperor Titus.
He was trying to state the preeminence of his dynasty, of his emperorship. He was trying to go one better than anyone before.
50,000 people, possibly more, filled the stands. It's a packed house. This is the hottest ticket in town.
You had a fantastic bird's-eye view from up there on the stands. It's very, very steep, the Colosseum, 4 stories high.
The crowds have come to see the best the empire has to offer. One of the main attractions, this man. His name is Carpophorus. He's a gladiator, but he doesn't fight men. He fights animals to the death in the arena.
Carpophorus is a guy who, he only comes into the limelight by chance because a poet, Martial, wrote a whole book of epigrams about the opening of the Games. He names Carpophorus as the guy who beat all records. He killed the best number of animals ever. He killed the most animals on a day. He was the strongest and bravest.
Carpophorus was a superstar among Venatores, and he was something of a darling with the crowds, had a big reputation and a big reputation to live up to.
But it's unlikely that Carpophorus ended up fighting animals because he wanted to. More likely, he was forced into the trade.
I think you have to assume that Carpophorus comes from, let's call it, a very humble social background. He could easily be an ex-slave, he could easily be a war captive. Obviously, it's a very dangerous trade with a limited life expectancy.
Participants in arena spectacles, that's both gladiators and also hunters and beast handlers, were of a low social status, but they were very skilled, so that the audience must have had a very complex reaction to them, because in social terms they could despise them, but they admired them tremendously for their skill and their courage.
It was a true test of courage to face a lethally dangerous animal who was cornered with just a spear.
But what animal would Carpophorus do battle with today? Would it be the Caledonian bear, the Barbary lion, the Bengal tiger, or some other exotic?
I doubt that the spectators in the Colosseum would know beforehand what specific animals Carpophorus was going to fight on any one occasion. Not knowing what animals would come forth to battle Carpophorus would add, of course, to the excitement of his exploits in the arena.
A trapdoor would have opened, and a handler would have probably used burning straw to drive the animal out into the Colosseum, where Carpophorus would be waiting.
Thrust out into the spotlight, the bear would be startled. But his attention would soon be taken by the man who wants to kill him.
And there would be that moment of, you could hear a pin drop as everyone was absolutely intent on what would happen next. And they faced one another.
Seeing someone face death and a deadly combatant skillfully and bravely was, for the Romans, what the Games in some ways were all about. But there weren't very many repeat performances. And so every time Carpophorus would have won, the crowd would have exploded because he had done it again.
Well, nowadays people still hunt animals for sport, and we have inhibitions in the sense that we are aware of animal rights and that kind of thing. The Romans had no sensitivity to a notion of animal rights. And they were fascinated, I think, by the enormous strength and speed of these animals, and very interested in seeing whether man could outwit them. And the ancient hunters, of course, were far more vulnerable than modern hunters because they didn't have firearms.
Carpophorus has triumphed once. Now he will fight again. This time against the Barbary lion.
I think it's absolutely certain that Carpophorus was fighting the animals close up. hand-to-hand combat in the sense of a man attacking a lion with his hands, I think is inconceivable. It would be so dangerous. But obviously he has a weapon at every point. But it's no fun for the crowd if he is too safe. Just like in a bullfight, the riveting moment is as the bull gets closer and closer and closer, and you dance around the bull in its dying moments, and it's that feeling of proximity that is so scary, and you really don't know who is going to die.
We simply don't know how many of these animal fights were scheduled on a typical day at these opening games, but we do know that Carpophorus likely faced the animals in the morning. Top billing was reserved for the gladiators in the afternoon, man on man.
They were the capstone, the climax, the big finish.
Romans called men like Carpophorus gladiators, or hunters. The ancient sources tell us his greatest feat was killing 20 animals in a single day. His next opponent, a leopard. The opening games of the Colosseum were celebrated over 100 days. By the end of it, 9,000 animals will be dead. That's an average of 90 animals killed every day. The Roman poet Martial compared Carpophorus to Heracles, the mythical Greek hero. But the ultimate fate of Carpophorus remains a mystery.
Because of his evident fighting prowess in the arena, it's possible that at some point after the Colosseum Games, Carpophorus was able to retire from the arena.
Very, very few gladiators, though, were allowed to retire. The best that most could hope for was an honorable death and perhaps a chance at a decent burial. And so Carpophorus, it's likely that he met his own death facing the animals that he was forced to fight. And in this way, Carpophorus in some ways is like the animals themselves. Both are untamed species that have to be cleansed from the empire, and both do it by fighting each other.
There was a time when the Romans didn't need to see animals killed in order to appreciate them. Hundreds of years before the Colosseum was even built, enthralled crowds were spellbound by a triumphant march of elephants at the Circus Maximus. What made the Romans turn the corner from spectators to killers? When the Roman Emperor Titus presided over the inaugural games of the Colosseum, he opened the door to a mass slaughter of animals. In the first 100 days alone, 9,000 animals were slaughtered. That's 90 animals killed every day.
Seeing men and animals in combat gave the Romans an opportunity to see nature in action and to evaluate whether raw nature could outdo human wit and skill.
The killing went on for some 700 years. Experts aren't clear on the exact animal body count, but even conservative estimates are staggering.
We're clearly talking about many tens of thousands, I would say many hundreds of thousands, and probably millions of animals killed.
But to understand how and why it all began, we've got to travel back to a time way before the Colosseum was built, to a time when Rome was a republic.
The Republic was a time when the games really came together, and they were formed out of public rituals and processions and executions that Roman nobles were responsible for putting on for the state and to advance their own prestige.
Just a short distance from where the Colosseum would one day be built lies a giant park, which has largely been abandoned to the elements. But sometime around the 6th century BC, a circus was built here, Rome's first big entertainment venue, the Circus Maximus.
The Circus Maximus was built as the main venue for chariot racing.
The circus held up to 250,000 spectators, the track running either side of a spina with turning posts. For the races, horses and charioteers were each assigned teams.
In Rome, there were 4 groups: the reds, the whites, the greens, and the blues.
The chariot races of the Circus Maximus were recreated for the most expensive silent movie ever made, Ben-Hur, in 1925. A typical race involved 12 chariots with 4 horses tethered to each chariot. Crowds loved it, mainly because crashes were inevitable.
Chariot racing was the NASCAR of the ancient world. Imagine getting on a wheelchair that was strapped backwards to a set of 4 horses or more and yelling, "Yeah, giddy up!" and taking off with competitors in a free-for-all around the stadium. It was spectacular, it was dangerous, and it was exciting.
And so there were many, many, many accidents. And a lot of horses died in the arena or broke their legs. And when you broke your leg in antiquity, it was finished.
For the horses, it was a no-win scenario. But the era of animal cruelty was only just beginning. After conquering Italy in the 3rd century BC, the Roman Republic came into conflict with the other superpowers around them. Carthage in North Africa, and the Hellenistic kingdom left by Alexander the Great. Within 2 centuries, the Romans dominated the Mediterranean basin.
When the Romans move into North Africa, they also move into African animals. So it's with the wars against the Carthaginians, particularly in the first war against the Carthaginians, there's a big defeat in 251, and they capture 100 elephants.
The elephants are taken back to Rome in a triumphant display.
The triumph was a Roman general's ultimate honor, in which he was allowed to parade the spoils taken from the enemy through the city of Rome. In the case of the Carthaginian elephants, parading them would have been like parading the Carthaginians' ultimate weapon, because the elephant was like the atom bomb of the ancient world.
These animals were not hunted, but admired and gawped at and gaped at. People hadn't seen anything like this in their lives, and it was a rare treat just to be able to look at these animals.
First, the Romans were only curious on them. They want to see them. They were astonished. But after 20 or 30 years, they were accustomed to it, and then they wanted more.
And that's why, quite rapidly, it leads on to doing more than just processing around with animals. You've got to have a bit of action.
Crowds wanted to be entertained. The Circus Maximus was a showcase venue for gladiatorial combat, man on man, often resulting in the death of one or the other. Some historians believe the growing popularity of the gladiator fights led organizers to adopt a more violent and bloody aspect to the animal spectacles as well.
So that the animal events didn't seem boring when compared to contemporary gladiatorial combat.
The first major animal hunts, or venationes, were staged by Pompey the Great,
who at that time was preeminent in the Roman world. I mean, he bestrode the Roman world like a colossus. He was the man. And to show that he was going to go all out, no expense spared, all the stops pulled out to impress.
One of Pompey's major trump cards was to release no less than 600 lions and 400 leopards into the arena all at once. Then they were picked off by Rome's finest hunters, or venatores. For the Romans, these hunts were primarily about taming nature.
They're surrounded by this wild, untamed world with horrendous wild animals in it. They're bringing mildness, tameness, civilization to that world of nature.
And the Roman society was a warrior society. It was based upon the Roman army. They weren't squeamish about this. They expected their soldiers to be used to the sight of blood and not to go squeamish about it. And life was full of death.
The people's appetite for animal spectacles had well and truly been whetted. The Circus Maximus was not, however, an ideal venue.
And one of the things which really is very extraordinary is how long it took Rome to actually build a purpose-built amphitheatre for the display of both the animal shows and the gladiatorial combats.
The Colosseum became the largest such venue in the entire Roman Empire, and news of its success quickly spread, setting off a rash of imitations.
I think one of the most remarkable phenomena about the Colosseum, about amphitheatres in general, is just how many places in the Roman world acquire amphitheatres. They become almost standard issue places of entertainment for any half-decent Roman city. We're here in Puteoli, which was a really important Roman port, and this is one of the biggest amphitheatres in Italy. That's because it's a big city. Capua, nearby, was also a very big city, and it has another enormous amphitheatre. But it's actually fascinating that tiny little places had their tiny little amphitheatres. Not all amphitheatres were built like this, out of solid concrete and brick. And we're not just talking about Roman Italy, we're talking about every province. And that, of course, means a need for a supply of beasts.
The animal spectacles created a new industry, the capture and transport of exotics from Africa and beyond. They were captured using pits, torches, nets, even alcohol. And once imprisoned, the animals were transported up to 3,000 miles, all the way to Rome, many never even making it alive. When Pompey the Great ordered the slaughter of over 1,000 animals in the Circus Maximus, there followed a dramatic escalation in the size and scale of animal spectacles at the Roman Games. The Colosseum came to Rome, and hundreds of amphitheaters soon sprung up in every corner of the growing empire. When the Romans hunted and killed animals in the arena, it wasn't just about entertainment for the masses.
empire is about many things, and one of the things it's about is control. And so showing these exotic animals in the arena was, I think, a type of control.
Of course the Romans needed to dominate nature, because nature is the world. If you're going to dominate the world, you've got to dominate nature.
But that was easier said than done. In order to fill the amphitheaters with animals, the Romans had to catch the animals and then transport them, sometimes thousands of miles.
We can see that getting a huge number of animals to, for example, the Colosseum before a big show was a major logistical headache.
So how did the Romans do it in a world without tranquilizer darts or helicopters? The remains of this Roman villa in Sicily provide some fascinating clues. It dates back to the 4th century AD, and scholars believe it may have been owned by a Roman magistrate. The villa contains the world's largest collection of Roman mosaics, and many of them show how animals were caught for the blood spectacles.
What this owner is saying, basically, to the people looking at this film, I went to the ends of the earth to get prize animals for my games.
Africa was a rich hunting ground for the Romans. There they targeted the big five: lion, leopard, buffalo, elephant, and rhinoceros. Civilians got involved, and so did special units of Roman soldiers, dedicated solely to the task of providing animals for the arena spectaculars. One popular method of capturing the big cats began with digging a large pit. Lions could well have been captured in the following way.
You dig a pit, and you put a pole in the center, and on the pole you put a goat. Then you cover over the pit, and you build a low wall around the whole pit. That way, when the lion comes, he sees this goat kebab hanging there. But he can't see the ground around the pit without jumping over the wall. And once he jumps over the wall, you have his goat.
The Romans would leave the lion in the pit, sometimes for several days, until it grew ravenous.
Then the hunters would lower a baited cage into the pit, and they capture the lion that way.
To capture elephants, Roman trappers employed a different technique.
What happened was that, first of all, a very large and deep ditch was dug around an enclosure.
Well-fed tame female elephants were put inside the enclosure. And when wild bull elephants, attracted by their scent, followed the females in, the trappers would remove a drawbridge to the enclosure.
There wasn't anything for the male elephants to eat inside the enclosure. And after a few days, they would get very hungry and very distressed and very weakened.
Hunters, riding atop other bull elephants, would then enter the enclosure and do battle with the weakened males.
And they would, in effect, wear them out, and they would collapse to the ground, and they'd capture the elephant in that way.
The Romans used a variety of methods in order to capture these animals. One of the more popular methods was the use of nets. Sometimes the Roman hunters would enter the lairs of the animals in question, such as bear caves, and attempt to drive the animals out into a waiting net.
Animals, like people, can be panicked by fire. And so hunters would use torches. The panicked animal running out would be disoriented enough and afraid enough that it would run right into the nets or right into a pit or waiting trap.
Other times, Roman trappers would use alcohol to disorient the animals.
Presumably the Romans, when they decided to use alcohol as bait, would pour it into some sort of trough. These animals then, such as monkeys, would approach the alcohol in question, and after drinking their fill would either fall asleep or pass out, thereby, of course, making them easy prey for Roman trappers.
Having captured the animals, the Romans then had to transport them, another monumental task.
One of the more extraordinary aspects of the whole animal trade was the sheer distances that some of these beasts travel.
For example, many of the animals that ended up fighting for their lives in the Roman Colosseum were captured as far away as Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa. First, the animals were transported overland to a coastal port on the Red Sea.
They then had a 1,400-mile journey up to Suez. No Suez Canal, so what happened then? They would have been taken overland, either 100 miles westward to the River Nile, and then down the Nile to Alexandria, or else straight overland to Alexandria, which is about 200 miles from Suez. There is then another journey of 1,300 miles by sea from Alexandria to Rome. That is a 3,000-mile journey for some of these beasts.
Ethiopia to Rome, that's the equivalent of walking from New York to San Francisco.
Even though these animals were valuable commodities, we have to assume that many of them didn't make it on their journey.
The sea journeys were the most challenging, especially for the elephants, which typically need to drink at least 50 gallons of water a day and eat over 400 pounds of vegetation. And they would be at sea for up to 20 days if they were coming from Egypt.
Can you imagine what this would be like with a boat full of elephants? Even just one of these animals, spooked by weather or some other phenomenon, could have a disastrous effect on the voyage.
The elephants not only had to deal with the unfamiliarity of seaborne transport, but also with the whole loading and unloading process, which could also be an ordeal as well.
Pliny the Elder, the Roman author and naturalist, wrote about one particularly difficult disembarkation involving elephants at Pozzuoli in southern Italy.
The story goes that the elephants were afraid to cross the gangplank onto shore because they didn't like looking at the water as they walked over the gangplank.
The handlers came up with a creative solution to the problem. They turned the elephants around, somehow convincing them to walk backwards down the gangplank so the elephants looked up at the sky and not down at the water.
This illustrates the sort of problems that could be caused by nervous elephants during any stage of their voyage.
Making landfall in Italy was one thing. Making it to Rome was quite another. And there were dangers for humans as well as animals.
Now, we hear about animals being kept at the docks, for example. And we hear a wonderful story about an artist called Basitiles, who went down to the docks to draw a lion in its cage. Thought this was too good an opportunity to miss, the opportunity to actually draw a lion from the flesh. Unfortunately, a leopard in another cage managed to break out of its container and ate Basitiles for dinner.
It's often been said that all roads lead to Rome, and that was true enough for animals as well as Roman subjects at the height of the empire. By the time the animals arrived in the ancient capital, they were tired, sick, often close to death.
And it was very important, especially if they'd had a long sea journey, that they were nursed back to full strength. The populace didn't want to see emaciated, miserable, scrawny-looking beasts. They wanted to see them in prime condition.
So the Romans established semi-rural animal enclosures, or ruauria, in and around the capital.
Presumably the animals would have been let out of their cage, but clearly if there were different species of animals, they couldn't all be left in the same enclosure, so there must have been a series of different paddocks.
This was the only true bright spot in the animals' journey, the one time since being captured that they might have been treated with respect and allowed some freedom of movement.
Soon as the spectacle approached, the numbers would swell and the animals would then be crated up and shipped off to the dark and dank world of the Hypogeum, directly under the Colosseum floor.
For the animals, a much deadlier game awaited. The Hypogeum, or basement, was their final staging post. Here they would be roughly shoved into cages, hoisted up, and released via a ramp into the arena. The animals were just moments from certain death. The Romans slaughtered animals in the arena for some 700 years. Hundreds of thousands of animals, maybe millions, were killed.
Our first instinct is always to condemn people in the past because they have slightly different moralities from our own. And one of the ways that our moralities function is by disapproving of other moralities.
With very few exceptions, the Romans didn't believe what they were doing was wrong.
The Romans didn't like to believe that animals had souls. There were animals, human beings, and gods, an escalator going upwards. And only from humans and gods did souls exist in creation.
After being taken from their homes and transported up to 3,000 miles to Rome, the animals had a brief respite in zoo-like enclosures. Finally, they journeyed to the Hypogeum, in the basement of the Colosseum. This complex labyrinth of tunnels and corridors is still evident today, thanks to a deep excavation under the floor of the Colosseum's arena.
The Hypogeum is the basement to the Colosseum, and it's enormously big. It's 2 stories high, and it has installations for winching cages up from the bottom right up to the floor level of the arena, and trapdoors that would then allow access into the arena space.
Dr. Heinz-Jürgen Best of the German Archaeological Institute spent several years studying the Colosseum's basement. Today he's examining the Hypogeum under the main arena at Pozzuoli, near Naples, similar to its parent in Rome.
I think the animals arrived in the evening, at night, or early in the morning.
Dr. Best says the animals would have been roughed up the moment they arrived in the Hypogeum. Let's take the example of a tiger.
The first step was to place this animal, this tiger, in a narrow corridor.
The tiger would have been pushed and prodded past rows and rows of cages until arriving at a lift. The lift was operated by 2 teams of men working a winch system attached to a central pole over 2 levels.
The best part of this system was that the mechanism was not actually visible, because the mechanics remained underneath the arena. The audience could not see what was going on. They only saw that at some point the animal would come out without knowing where from.
The tiger's cage is lifted and locked into a new position directly under the arena floor. It's ready to be released. Meanwhile, upstairs, the emperor is presiding over the day's entertainment. When the tiger does emerge into the arena, there's little chance of it escaping up into the crowds. The walls of the arena are 13 feet high.
In addition, there may also have been archers posted on the podium wall who, again, could have conceivably shot any animals who appeared to be getting too rambunctious or getting too close to the barricade.
Records suggest no animals ever managed to climb up the walls and into the stands of the Colosseum. Down below, the tiger is next in line for fighting. But before releasing it, the boss of the Hypogeum waits for a signal from above.
tutto questo meccanismo inizia con segnali che arrivano dalla arena, quando l'imperatore più o meno era seduto e decideva adesso iniziamo, adesso vogliamo fare qualcosa di particolare che il pubblico non aspetta.
A group of Venatores wait patiently in the basement for the call-up. But they can rest easy for a little while longer yet. The organizers are aware that the Emperor likes surprises and have prepared accordingly. Little does the tiger know it, but he's about to encounter a new breed of animal fighter, ready to battle to the death. Organizers of the Roman Games were always striving to outdo themselves in the name of entertainment. One innovation involved the introduction of female animal fighters, or Venatrix.
There's a little bit of evidence that women performed the role of hunters in the arena, and obviously were seen, I think, as very transgressive figures, because one doesn't expect to see women hunting dangerous animals.
This Venatrix would likely have known she was about to fight a tiger, but the tiger would have no idea of what it was about to face.
One aspect of the animal games which I think is important to bear in mind is that, okay, you've got your animal in his cage, the trapdoor is open, but what the animal faces is a barrage of sound reverberating around the arena. And that is terrifying for an animal. The animal wouldn't come out of its cage. It would stay in its cage. It would be terrified. And the only way to get it out of its cage would be to wave torches near it.
They stimulated them with sticks, with fire, with everything they had to activate them, because people were only satisfied when they had a spectacular fight.
When she faced the big cat in the arena, the crowd would have faced this moment with anticipation. Here was this unusual hunter facing this deadly cat. How would she take it on?
The Venatrix elects to play a waiting game with the tiger, hoping to draw it in rather than chase it. That's one less tiger roaming the wild. Sadly, of little concern to the Romans.
The Romans were downright unsympathetic to animals over and over again. There's absolutely no compassion shown to animals. They were there to be exploited as either food or a source of entertainment for the populace.
But look at it from the perspective of the Venatrix. It was a matter of her own life or the tiger's. She was most likely trained at the same school as the male Venatores.
We don't know very much about the training of the animal fighters in Rome or indeed anywhere else, but we do know that immediately east of the Colosseum there were a series of training schools.
One of those schools was called the Ludus Matutinus, Latin for morning school, because the animal fighters always performed in the mornings. Here the Venatores in training received instruction in the best techniques to hunt and kill animals.
Remember that the people who act as beast hunters are the lowliest of Romans. They suffer from a special condition called infamia. They're the infamous people.
Rome's elite were mostly happy to view the games from their ringside seats. For any of them to cross the threshold and become a participant was seen as a betrayal of their class. So imagine their horror when one of their own made the switch. His name was Commodus. The year is AD 192. Commodus has been emperor for 12 years, but instead of looking outward, continuing the tradition of Roman conquest, his reign has been marked by a period of inactivity. Commodus is the son of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors.
There's this weird thing that great father, terrible son. Commodus does absolutely everything wrong.
Commodus decided that just being emperor wasn't enough. He loved the arena spectacles, and his inner voice told him to pick up his bow and arrow and fire away. As a beast hunter, a Venatore.
The fact that he wanted to appear in the games as a gladiator, as a beast hunter, is like throwing away the entire Roman rulebook. You lose your social status if you appear. Surely you know this, Commodus. But what he does is sort of leapfrog it all and say, no, I'm a sort of super gladiator, super beast hunter.
On one occasion, in one of his more famous animal-killing exploits, Commodus is credited with killing 100 bears on the floor of the Colosseum. The animals killed by the Emperor Commodus did not really enjoy a fighting chance.
He was not there mingling with the beasts at risk of attack from their claws and their teeth. He was in a safe place up in the stands.
With Commodus, the dice were always loaded. It was simply a demonstration of his skill as a hunter with no competitive element at all.
As it happens, the historian Dio was a senator under Commodus. He sat there in the games, and we have a riveting account from Dio about how awful it was to be a senator right there in the front row at the games, and your emperor is making a real fool of himself.
For Commodus, killing animals was more than just a sport. He came to fancy himself as a reincarnation of Hercules.
Commodus is very interested in associating himself with Hercules. And we do have the most amazing marble statue of him with the lion's skin of Hercules over his head, a terrifying image of an emperor. And you have to remember, Hercules isn't just the greatest of all beast hunters, the man who killed the Nemean lion and the Hydra and so on and so on. Many of Hercules' labors were killing beasts. But he is the man who civilized the world. And that's what the emperor does. He tames the forces of nature.
Commodus may have seen himself as a second Hercules, but the Roman aristocracy would have looked at this as an affront to Roman dignity. The emperor, after all, was the head of state, and this would be as if the president of the United States suddenly decided that being a part of pro wrestling was more important than governing. Commodus's actions, and the fact that he seemed to be proud of this, was simply intolerable.
Whenever Emperor Commodus got down into the arena itself, it wasn't to fight the animals that could kill him. Instead, he targeted the harmless, the defenseless, like ostriches.
And Commodus, he had various tricks, the most absurd of which is shooting the heads off ostriches on the run with a special kind of arrow with a semicircular end. Dio recounts very vividly how, on one occasion, Commodus has managed to decapitate an ostrich, and he takes the ostrich and he turns to the rows of senators with a great grin on his face and, look what I bagged. But, of course, the senators read it as a very different kind of message. This could be you, mates. But they're also struck by the absurdity of the situation. And in Dio's account, hilarious laughter comes over them, and they don't know what to do, because, of course, if they laugh at the emperor, there with a dripping head of an ostrich in front of them, they're all for the chop. And Dio says, I was the hero of the occasion. I realized how to stop giggling. And I took a laurel leaf from my crown I was wearing, and I started chewing the laurel leaf. It's an early form of chewing gum. And so we escaped. We didn't laugh at the emperor to his face.
Ultimately, however, the senators, and indirectly the animals, got their revenge. Commodus met his end at the hands of those closest to him, who had lost all confidence in him.
They paid off his gym teacher, a guy by the name of Narcissus, to strangle him. And as soon as he was dead, the Senate and the people went on a rampage to eliminate any trace of Commodus from memory.
For the animals, much more bloodshed was still to come. The Roman spectacles played host to another equally cruel sport: animals forced to fight each other. And far from being given a decent burial, the losing animal often ended up on someone's dinner table. The Romans publicly humiliated animals by making them fight against men, women, and even emperors in the arena for hundreds of years. And the challenge for each new emperor was to go one better than his predecessor, to make his games the best ever.
People like to think in terms of what's the typical venatio, what's the typical thing to put on. But in a sense, that was exactly what they didn't want. They wanted surprise for the audience. So you have to wow the audience each time.
It's early morning in the Colosseum. The crowd is settling in for another big day of games. The climax will come with bloody gladiatorial bouts in the afternoon.
A program of a day of killing and murdering. We can't imagine. A program of 6 hours of killing.
Mornings are reserved for the animals, and the organizers are out to impress. They want to open the show with something so shocking that no one can take their eyes off it. Today, a tiger will fight a black panther to the death.
It's difficult to actually unravel the origins of one animal fighting another in the context of the arena, because we don't actually have the information about when it started. We just know that from various mosaics that it happened. I think that it probably came about as an attempt to introduce a new spin, a new twist on the animal fights. And also, I think that there was something of a curiosity of the Romans as to who was top dog, if you like, in the animal world.
The Romans were aware that there were enmities in nature and that the animals were territorial, and so they would have attacked animals that threatened their habitat.
The Romans also encouraged mismatches in the arena, like making an African lion fight a Bengal tiger.
You've probably heard children wonder things like, what if Godzilla met Megatron? Or what if Batman took on Spider-Man? Well, the Romans had similar curiosities about matching animals against each other that never would have fought each other in the wild.
People wanted these fightings. They asked the organization that there should be wild animals, the king of the desert, the king of the forest, to fight. It was a big event when a lion fought against a bear, or a bear to a tiger. It was a very hard fighting.
In the games of Titus, a rhino was pitted against both a bull and a bear. And the rhino had to be goaded into fighting both of them.
It's possible the Romans used something like this, a flaming arrow or dart, to arouse the anger of the rhino.
Once it was enraged enough to fight, it fought very successfully indeed.
It not only killed the bull, but it tossed the bear into the air like a piñata, and the crowd went wild.
Sometimes the Romans upped the stakes for the animals by chaining them together in the arena, like this ancient Libyan mosaic shows. The Romans wanted to make the bull and the bear feel like they were invading each other's personal space.
If you could determine the minimum distance where an animal would feel aggressive and then chain two animals together at a shorter length than that, you were almost guaranteed to get a violent interaction between the two animals.
Writings from the period suggest the Romans developed favorites among the animals. The cult of celebrity, it seems, was alive and well 2,000 years ago.
Statius records one particular celebrity animal in his poetry. Now, this animal, a lion, died quite unexpectedly in the arena after having been pitted against evidently a much weaker animal.
It was as if a favorite gladiator had been killed by an unknown. The poet Statius tells us that the emperor, the senate, and even the people were saddened by the loss of this lion, as if it was a popular personality.
Whatever attachments they may have felt, the Romans had to face the practicalities of what to do with all the animals who didn't make it out of the arena alive.
We know that on some occasions, at least, the dead animals in the arena would be butchered, and the arena meat, so to speak, would be distributed to the Roman populace in a sort of communal banquet after the spectacle in question. This was another way, of course, for the spectacle organizer to gain further popularity among the spectators by granting them this free gift of meat.
The average Roman didn't have a great deal of meat in the diet. It was mainly a kind of a porridge with veg and, that was kept on the boil 24/7. And new things were chucked into the pot, and it must have been a great relief to have a bit of meat.
Some got a hare, another a part of a lion or a part of a bear. And that's my opinion, because it was very good meat.
The Romans also had their hands full cleaning the floor of the arena. With so many animals slain each day, blood was a constant companion.
At the end of the day, the arena would need to be cleansed. The blood and the gore would be carted away or washed off into the sluices that ran underneath the arena, and fresh sand would be added, so that the next day the arena could stand clean and ready for a new day of entertainment.
The Romans had yet more surprises in store for the animals of the arena. They unwittingly became the world's first four-legged executioners, forced into attacking Rome's enemies, including Christians. The Romans made scapegoats of animals in their arena spectaculars for 7 centuries. forcing them to fight humans and other animals in order to satisfy the whims of successive emperors. But the Romans had another shock in store.
And animals were used to kill people. People are thrown in the arena for the wild animals.
Lunchtime at the Colosseum was execution time, Roman style.
You were either on the right side of the Roman Empire or on the wrong side, and if you were on the wrong side, you were in very big trouble. That was the message of the Colosseum.
Prisoners began their final journey by being sorted into two groups, Romans and non-Romans.
If you were a Roman citizen, you would probably be beheaded. If you were not a Roman citizen and a slave, you would probably go into the arena.
There's evidence to suggest the Romans used animals to execute their enemies as far back as 167 BC. Arena executions exploded in popularity during the early empire.
In one case, the guy is tied to a stake and there's a leopard climbing up him. The guy is in a little chariot on wheels, and there's another person with a large pole pushing the guy in the chariot towards the advancing cat.
It was intended as a deterrent. I mean, these deaths were intentionally made as gruesome as possible. Romans didn't use prisons. Justice was very summary.
And that becomes, from the 2nd century AD onwards, simply a standard form of punishment and a standard form of entertainment. And that's the context in which Christians get thrown to the lions.
Today, Christianity is the Western world's largest religion. But it was a very different story when the first Christians emerged at the height of the Roman Empire. They were regarded as a major threat.
The Christians were monotheists. They believed in one God, and it wasn't the emperor. And they refused to worship the divinity of the Roman emperor, and therefore they were potentially very subversive politically.
The Roman response was to eliminate the threat. The most well-known case of a Christian being thrown to the lions is that of St. Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch. He was arrested and brought to Rome to die in the arena.
One of the surest ways for an early Christian to prove his or her devotion to the faith and thereby gain the crown of martyrdom was to steadfastly undergo execution in the arena without renouncing Christianity.
In a series of letters to the Romans before his death, St. Ignatius expresses the hope that he'll excite the animals in the arena, so they will eat him in the shortest possible time.
When St. Ignatius says he hopes the animals will make short work of him, that of course reflects the extreme terror and difficulty of all these executions. It's hard to get the animals to attack. There they are in front of a crowd of thousands, tens of thousands of people making an enormous row. And they've been abused, their capture has been brutal, they've been shipped across the sea, they've felt seasick for days.
It's an all too familiar scenario. Using torches or hot pokers, the Romans would inflame the animal until such time it snapped. These public executions were popular with the masses, but Rome's intellectual elite was less enthusiastic. Seneca, the Roman philosopher from the 1st century AD, described the executions as massacres sine arte, or without artistry.
I think that's a pretty fair description. All you were seeing in most cases was a helpless individual being thrown to the beast.
But one such execution went on to be the stuff of legend.
One famous story involving criminal executions involves Androcles and the lion. This individual, an escaped slave, was subsequently captured and condemned to be killed by a lion in the arena. However, much to the audience's amazement, when the lion came onto the arena floor, it is said to have refused to kill Androcles, but instead have gone up to Androcles quite affectionately.
The emperor is outraged. He orders a leopard into the arena to finish the job. But the lion turns on the leopard and kills it.
The emperor demanded to know why the lion had not killed Androcles, whereupon Androcles replied that he had met the lion and befriended it during his period of freedom after having escaped from slavery.
And it emerges that Androcles had been in North Africa, and he'd come across this lion with a thorn in its paw, and he'd helped it out by removing the thorn from its paw, so that the lion was his friend for life.
The audience, we are told, was so impressed by this story that they demanded that Androcles be set free. And we are told by at least one source that subsequently Androcles could be seen proudly walking around the streets of the city with his pet lion, which had in effect saved him from execution in the arena.
One of the things the Androcles story illustrates is a storyline which we like very much, that sort of sympathy between human beings and animals. And it is there in antiquity too. It's not nearly so pronounced. The storyline they favor is animals as wild, terrifying beasts. But they also like to see the flip side of animals as potentially our friends.
That particular sympathy was first demonstrated in a very public way at the Circus Maximus during Pompey's games of 55 BC.
Pompey's spectacle, from a public relations point of view, was an unmitigated disaster, at least the elephant portion of his program.
Pompey drew praise for an audacious hunt where over 1,000 lions and leopards were killed by Rome's finest Venatores. However, he lost the support of the crowd when his finale, a big hunt involving 18 elephants, backfired.
He imported hunters from North Africa with javelins who began successfully to fell these elephants.
One elephant was killed instantly when a javelin penetrated below its eye.
Elephants are very intelligent and very social creatures. What's more, to get these elephants into the amphitheater, they had to trust people to some degree. And so when these same people turned on them, they must have stunned the animals. And it's no wonder then that they both seem to have appealed to the crowd and to have fought back against their attackers to protect their own kind.
And there's one elephant that goes down onto its knees, but even though it's on its knees, it continues to fight, and it takes the shields of its attackers and hurls them around it in a circle, in a perfect circle.
And the rest of the elephants panicked and ran towards the iron grill barrier that separated the spectators from the elephants in the arena.
Realizing there was no escape, the elephants aroused great pity by running around the arena, bellowing loudly.
The crowd gradually, they're moved by the piteous sound of the elephants until the crowd stand up and protest against Pompey and say, "You're being cruel. You've got to be kind to the elephants."
Cicero, the famous Roman politician and philosopher, was an eyewitness to the massacre.
And Cicero says, isn't this interesting, that this form of human sympathy with the beasts can exist? It's one of the first occasions we get a very important theme, because the beast shows are, of course, about cruelty and bestiality. But all descriptions of them also involve kindness and humanity. And so it's really bad when it flips around. The beasts, instead of being bestial, they are sympathetic. And it seems to be the man who's putting on the games who's cruel.
And Pompey didn't get glory for showing this particular show, because it was thought, this is a rare example of it from the ancient world, that this sort of level of cruelty to these noble beasts was unacceptable.
Pompey called off the hunt, and there's evidence to suggest the Romans had learned their lesson. In later spectacles, elephants were more likely to be found performing tricks for the amusement of the people. The Romans were forced to make other changes to the games when their empire began to crumble. Humans became the expendable ones in horrific games of do or die. The Roman blood spectacles caused untold damage to the animals of the ancient world.
They killed thousands and thousands, perhaps millions.
But is it fair to judge the Romans for what they did?
The attitude towards animals, which people in the West are used to, is really only something which came about in the 19th century with the formation of societies for the prevention of cruelty towards animals in the United States, in Northern Europe, and so on. But that is an attitude that would not have been understood by the ancient Romans. The idea that animals were something you could be sentimental towards.
The only time the Romans really questioned the slaughter was when they themselves came under attack. The Battle of Adrianople in the 4th century AD has often been called the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. In that battle, a tribe of Gothic rebels routed a Roman army led by the Emperor Valens. Many more losses followed, with obvious consequences for the arena spectaculars involving animals.
As the Roman Empire shrank, and as more and more territory fell under barbarian control, fewer and fewer animals were available for the Romans to procure for their spectacles.
With the big exotics in short supply, the Romans had to find new ways to excite public interest in the spectacles. So instead of hunting and killing animals in the arena, they devised games, which would later be recognizable in the modern-day rodeo. Take, for example, the wickerwork ball.
The idea here was that the performer would climb into these balls, and the ball would then be batted around by an enraged animal on the arena floor. Now, as one can imagine, undoubtedly there must have occasionally been mishaps with this particular contraption.
The The Romans also dreamt up a deadly game of hide-and-seek, involving a series of crude wooden panels attached to a pole.
The idea of this apparatus appears to have been that the performer would hide behind one of these panels and would rotate the panels around in order to keep one panel ahead, so to speak, of the attacking animal.
The Romans teased the arena animals in other ways.
There were baskets suspended from poles that were far enough off the ground so that the animals couldn't easily jump and catch the humans that were in the baskets spinning round.
And there was another game involving doors in the wall of the arena.
The Venator opens the door, he's armed with a spear, the animal charges, and at the last minute he slams the door until somebody makes a mistake and doesn't slam the door quickly enough. The thing that really astounded me was that I recognized a lot of things that I had witnessed as a kid at the rodeo. The straw dummies that were thrown in front of the Brahma bulls by the clowns, and the clowns themselves jumping into barrels and escaping, being tossed around by the bulls, and the clowns diverting the attention of the bulls away from the bull riders.
The Romans were also circus pioneers. Anyone who's been under the big top would have seen elephants taking center stage with their amazing acrobatic skills. Not so long ago, they still called this entertainment. Now a lot of people recognize it as animal cruelty. Records suggest that elephants played a prominent role in many of the Roman games.
We hear about incredible feats of animal training. There's a story of elephants who were actually trained to recline on couches and daintily consume food as if they were humans at a cena, an evening meal in Rome, which vastly amused the spectators.
These circus acts were the last big hurrah for the Roman games. After 700 years of wholesale slaughter, the last recorded venationes occurred in the 6th century AD. We'll never know how many animals had died by then. But animal stocks in the Mediterranean basin had been decimated.
Were the Romans responsible for wiping out any species of animal? We know about certain types of animal disappearing from certain parts of the ancient Mediterranean world. Elephants that used to be available on the north coast of Africa, the hippopotamus disappeared from Egypt before the end of the 4th century AD.
The way the Romans displayed animals in the empire has some very interesting ramifications today, and one of them is the change that was caused ecologically to North Africa in terms of ridding that part of the world of several species. But the Romans didn't have the ecological sensitivity that we gradually are acquiring today, and didn't realize that they'd actually changed the planet for good.
Atlas bears used to range freely in northern Africa from Libya to Morocco. The Romans had an enormous impact on these bears, but didn't kill them all. A modern-day hunter picked off the last one in the late 19th century. And then there's the case of the Barbary or Atlas lion, formerly a subspecies native to North Africa and hunted down mercilessly by the Romans for their spectacles. The last wild Barbary lion was shot by a poacher in Morocco in the last century.
It's true that one particular type of lion, which we call the Barbary lion, is now extinct. But it's actually our civilization that's managed to extinguish the Barbary lion, not the Romans. We are much more destructive on the animal stocks than the Romans ever were. And it's not just hunting, it's global warming, it's the whole transformation of the globe. I think that's one of the most important things you learn from looking at the past. Our generation is causing damage on a completely new scale.
But the animal kingdom is fighting back. new hopes have been raised in the Moroccan capital of Rabat, where a group of captive lions has been tested for links to the extinct Barbary. If the tests are ever proven, we could be looking at the resurrection of the lions that once did battle in the Roman Games. The Roman Games had a massive impact on wildlife in the Mediterranean basin. Barbary, or Atlas lions, a North African subspecies, were prized catches for the blood spectacles. Who knows how many ended up dead on the floor of the arena. However, it's believed the last wild Barbary was not killed until the 20th century in Morocco. Now there are new hopes of resurrecting this lost subspecies. Rabat Zoo is home to many captive animals, including elephants, hippos, chimpanzees, and some very special lions. In fact, the zoo was established to house these lions. They were a gift of the Moroccan king, and people here believe that they are descended from the original Barbary or Atlas lion that used to roam the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. The highest peak of these mountains has an elevation of over 13,000 feet.
Because it's in the Atlas, where it's snow, it's cold, it's freezing, they have a thick mane. It's a kind of king of the Atlas Mountains. And he was proud, and he was very aggressive.
Dr. Hadani, a former director of the zoo, embraced a 5-step plan aimed at releasing the lions into a 1,000-hectare sanctuary in their former home, the Atlas Mountains. The plan was called Project Barbary, and the first step was undertaking a study to establish whether the royal lions were indeed Barbaries.
And he started by taking samples from the skin, the feather, and the ivory dentition.
The DNA samples were compared to skeletal remains of wild Barbary lions held in European museums. The initial tests failed to establish a link, and more definitive testing could not be carried out because funding for the study dried up.
So they have been doing the job, and they stopped there. That's the end.
Despite the setback, zoo staff are hopeful that one day they'll be able to bring Project Barbary to a successful conclusion. There are reports of various other Barbaries held in captivity, including South Africa, Ireland, and England. But before it was suspended, the Moroccan plan was the most ambitious. We can only hope the scientific community rallies behind the quest to undo the mistakes of the past, allowing these majestic animals who once fought for their lives in the Roman Games to be restored to their natural habitat. Looking back on the blood spectacles, it's easy to condemn the Romans for the unbelievable cruelty they showed towards animals. But before rushing to judgment, take yourself back 2,000 years. The world inhabited by the Romans was a very different place to the world we know today.
The ancient world was populated much more sparsely with people and much more densely with animals than we really imagine. It was truly a wild, woolly, and often a very dangerous place.
Wildlife is part of nature, and undoubtedly they felt symbolically they had to control wildlife just as much as they had to control human beings.
Everywhere you looked in the ancient world, there was death all around you. Infant mortality rates were staggering by modern standards. 2 in 5 children might expect to reach adulthood, so that you would see your brothers and sisters dying. You would see public executions, which were very public, and meant to be so as deterrents to people who might consider doing something similar.
We still execute people in America, albeit not in public, and some people have a morbid fascination for these events.
Just witness the execution parties that take place outside of prisons today, or the 20,000 people who showed up for the last public execution in the United States in 1936. This is not an ancient phenomenon.
People still organize dogfights to the death. Cockfighting is popular in some parts of the world. And big game hunting safaris are still promoted as a recreational pursuit in Africa.
So I think we still can sense some of the instincts that the Romans were driven by when they performed these displays in their arenas.
Bullfights are still a major draw card in Spain and Mexico.
They take place in arenas. They have high walls to protect the spectators from the rushing bull. They have man versus beast. Is it cruel to the bull? You ask a Spaniard whether it should be banned. The answer is definitely not. It's part of Spanish culture, just as the Roman games were a quintessential part of Roman culture.
The arena spectaculars allowed the Romans to give vent to their darkest feelings in despicable ways for hundreds of years. But the fact is, 21st century humans have the potential to be just as barbarous again.
Man isn't changed. The environment of the people has changed, but not the people itself. The people is still the same.
We can only hope we'll never see a return to the old days and the old ways. That we will never allow ourselves as a people to let the dark side run riot, as the Romans did with their blood spectacles 2,000 years ago.